I just wanted to say that I'm really excited about this next session. Everywhere we go, it's a common theme that we can do better in improving our systems and making sure that they are equitable for all people. I think this conversation is one of the most important conversations that a continuum care organization can facilitate going forward, and we are so lucky to have a great resource in Choosing Our Roots in this state, who in many areas where there aren't robust service arrays, they're in. And they have connections that they've been bringing through our Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program grant that we wouldn't have if Choosing Our Roots didn't exist. So I'm really excited to have Julia here to talk about equity in our system and have a dialogue with our folks. So thank you, Julia, for being here.
Thanks. Hey, good morning. My name is Julia Terry. I use she, her, hers pronouns. My parents are Barbara and Terry McCarthy. My family is the Casale family and the Tom family from Nuktak. I think that it's important that we talk about our whole narrative when we come to the table to talk about addressing homelessness. And though our organization primarily serves people that are 13 to 24, I think that it's also important to remember that addressing youth homelessness addresses adult homelessness, because if we do early intervention, then hopefully we don't have chronic adult homelessness. And specifically with our lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer populations, if we do interventions for young people, hopefully we don't experience chronic homelessness. We always like to start our meetings with a land acknowledgement. So I just want to acknowledge that wherever we're working in the state, we're working on the unceded territories of Indigenous people of Alaska. And this land that we're on right now is Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian. So if you don't know the folks that live in your area, please go out and meet those people, because all of our work is intersectional. I'm super excited to be here today. I'm also a really nervous public speaker. So I try to do presentations that make you talk to each other. If you are at a table where you're sitting by yourself, if I could please encourage you to sit at a table with other people, because there's going to be some discussion that's happening here, that would be great. I know it's terrible to get up and move around a whole bunch, so just do what makes you feel comfortable. And we're going to start off actually with standing up. So if you are a person, wait, let me tell you why. Okay, so if you are a person who has ever in your life met a person who's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, gender expansive, queer, pansexual, or asexual, just met somebody. If you are a person who has met somebody that identifies as LGBTQ, please stand up. Okay. If you are a person who has met somebody who's LGBTQ plus, and they have experienced discrimination, ever, any kind of experience of discrimination, please stay standing up. If you are a person who knows an LGBTQ plus person who is somebody that you love, stay standing up. Everyone else, you can sit down. We know you like them, but you can sit down if they're not somebody that you love. Okay. If you are a person who identifies currently as an ally to LGBTQ plus people, stay standing. If you yourself are an LGBTQ plus person, stay standing. Everybody else sit down.
Question wasn't real clear.
If you are an ally to LGBTQ plus people, you consider yourself to be an ally to LGBTQ plus people, stay standing. If you yourself identify as an LGBTQ plus person, stay standing. If you think it's everybody, yeah, it's all one question. That way people don't have to identify that they themselves are queer in a room full of folks, okay? And if you are a person who believes that you have more learning to do about serving LGBTQ plus people, sit down. Yay! Good job to all of you. And I think that it's really important to recognize that sometimes when we have conversations about equity, the only people that stay in the room are the stakeholders or the allies. Now, that's not necessarily true today. People have lots of meetings, important meetings to be doing with our legislators, to be advocating for houseless people throughout the state of Alaska. So there are a lot of reasons that folks aren't in the room. But if you're in the room right now, you recognize that we have a challenge. And what we like to do with Choosing Our Roots is say that all of our challenges require collective healing and collective conversation and showing up at the table for difficult conversations. I finished my PowerPoint at 9 o'clock last night after 3 hours of sleep, so best of luck to us. Let's see how it goes. All right, so I always think that it's important to start off with, why are we talking about equity instead of equality? And so equity is about all of the people that we serve getting everything that they need in order to improve the quality of their situation. So in a really broad way, when we have conversations about equity, we're talking about intersection. We're talking about all of the things that create vulnerability for people. Part of the reason that I was up until 9 p.m., which doesn't seem very late to people, I'm sure, working on this PowerPoint is because yesterday while I was listening, I kept on revising my ideas around this. I grew up on the YK Delta in a community that's affected by diaspora, so people are moving out of the community because of climate change. Our community is just not going to exist any longer very soon. I'm really aware of housing overcrowding. Foote and I were talking earlier about some of the ways that climate change has impacted rural communities. When I was growing up, the snowfall was so deep that the entire house was covered with snow, and we would shovel our way out, right? And that snow acted as an insulant. So we did not spend as much money on our heating bill because we had snow. So when we think about intersections, we're not just talking about intersections of personal identity, we're also talking about the intersections of cultural identity and the ways that we live in this world. No one person is the expert. Every single person in this room has knowledge that we can share with one another and skills that we can capitalize on in order to address issues around homelessness and issues around equity. And it takes all of our voices, because I'm going to stand up here and I'm going to tell you what I know today, and what I know tomorrow is going to be different. And each of us from our different regions of the state have very specialized knowledge for the experiences of people in our state. This last part here, recognizing and acknowledging the scarcity of resources, including information. I love that everybody sat down when we said we have more to learn. I should have probably sat down too. I should have brought a seat up here so that I could sit down. We always have more to learn about how to serve one another more fully. But I'm also realizing, as I wrote that sentence about scarcity of resource, and as I listen to folks talk about there's not enough, we need more, we need to figure out different ways of doing, that I also want to shift that narrative. And this is something that we do a lot at Choosing Our Roots, is shift the narrative to positivity, which is that we always have enough because we have each other. We may not always have enough money, we may not always have enough houses, we may not always have enough heating oil, but we always have enough because we can capitalize on the resource of ourself, right? Okay. Has anybody ever heard of adverse childhood experiences? Raise your hand up in the air. Okay, adverse childhood experiences. There are a lot of folks that have heard of them. For those of you in the room, ACEs, they call it ACEs a lot. These are the top ones right here where it's the top part of the tree there, okay? And these are experiences that people have under the age of 18 that affect their outcomes later in life, though there's not a lot of research right now on resiliency, because there are a lot of people, myself included, have high ACEs scores, which means that I'll use myself as an example because that's better than using somebody else. I have a childhood history of emotional and sexual abuse, substance misuse, domestic violence, homelessness, mental wellness barriers, physical and emotional neglect. So I have a pretty high ACEs score. I also have high resiliency. And the only thing that we've been able to connect resiliency to so far is really good reciprocal relationship with an adult person, right? And when we talk about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, we tend to only talk about individual persons experiencing those ACEs, and we don't talk about community environment. So that's the root here, right? All of this stuff down here about poverty, discrimination, Disruption of community, that's all of your supports, and sometimes that's about moving from community to community so you don't have your natural supports in place. Lack of opportunity, we've been talking a lot about economic issues in our rural communities, but also in our urban and semi-urban communities, I think. Poor housing quality and affordability. I remember, so this is gonna date myself a little bit, but I remember when they arrested the Unabomber, and all over the news, they were talking about his terrible shack that he was living in. And I was like, 20 by 20 with a loft? Whoa, right? So the ways that we live sometimes affect us adversely, and sometimes they're just the ways that we live, right? One of the things that I think is really important for us to recognize is that in Alaska, we have a lot of adults who identify as people with high ACEs scores. We know that we experience a lot of really adverse community environments, including, it's interesting to me, I didn't realize this until just now, but I don't see anything down there on the bottom about death loss, specifically around suicidality. And that's one of the things that I think is really important when we're talking about I was trying to be fancy and have little things float in, so there we go. When we're talking about lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, gender expansive, queer, two-spirit, and other decolonized indigenous communities, that all of these places where you see those fancy red lightning bolts, people that are part of this community experience those things at greater rates, okay? And in addition to that, LGBTQ plus young people are 120% more likely to experience homelessness due to these adverse community environments and adverse childhood experiences. In addition to that, LGBTQ plus young people are 8 times more likely to attempt suicide, not consider suicide, attempt suicide, than their heterosexual counterparts. And when we start talking to people about how they experience homelessness and why they experience homelessness, almost all of the LGBTQ plus people that we speak to say that they experience homelessness because they didn't have a safe environment to be themselves in, to be their whole person in. I can't remember what my next slide is, so I'm gonna click. Okay, good. So these are just a couple of quotes that I pulled out here about why equity in all of our programming is important, right? So I think that it's really important to note that Choosing Our Roots, which has been around for 3 years as a collective organization, a year and a half as a nonprofit organization, and 1 year as an organization with a paid staff person, okay? Yeah, so Choosing Our Roots is the only queer-centered, queer-run, youth-centered organization for housing in the entire state. Yay! That's a celebration. We can't do it all, right? And we've been talking a lot about data collection and about having good numbers, and part of the reason that we haven't existed until now is that there's terrible data. Guess what? People don't ask what people's gender identity is. People don't ask what people's relationship orientation is. And when you don't ask that question, inadvertently or not, you are perpetuating discrimination because we do not get a good picture of the people that we're serving. We do know that LGBTQ plus people don't access services at the same rates as heterosexual people. And they don't access those services because of some of these things. Referring trans women, specifically trans feminine people, because a lot of times shelters are gender segregated. Trans women end up leaving the shelter because they're being misgendered or harassed. And this might be because they're a trans feminine person and they're told that they have to go to a shelter for men, right? Or they're a trans feminine person and they attempt to access shelter at a women's only facility and they're told that that's not an appropriate sheltering environment for them. I mentioned earlier that we serve people aged 13 to 24. In the 1 year of our existence, basically anybody who's LGBTQ plus, even if they're over the age of 24, ends up calling me at some point or another if they're experiencing homelessness. Because again, I refer back to that we're the only queer-centered organization, and people want to go and talk to somebody who's gonna feel comfortable talking to them. So what can you do about that? You can educate yourselves, right? You can ask what the gaps are in your services. You can say, how can we do better for LGBTQ plus people? Even if you think that maybe you can't serve LGBTQ plus people adequately in your environment, you need to figure out how to collaborate with people who can, right? Let's see. LGBTQ people experiencing homelessness are isolated. Providers aren't trained. There's nothing that's just for me, and I don't feel comfortable asking. So sometimes it's not just a matter of not asking the people about their identity and their whole self. It's also about people understanding that if they ask the question, they may face further discrimination. So I'll just read a quote. So as I said, I was changing everything all morning long. So this morning I got on to Instagram because I'm trying to be cool and less of a Luddite. And I saw this quote. And the quote was, "Queer people don't grow up as ourselves. We grow up playing a version of ourselves that sacrifices authenticity to minimize humiliation and prejudice. The massive task of our adult life is to unpick the parts of ourselves that are truly us and which parts that we've created to protect us." And I think that that quote adequately sums up the experiences of almost every queer person that I have ever met. We spend a lot of time living in a culture that has shifted substantially even in my lifetime. I'm 43. When I first came out, Ellen had not come out on television. There were no representations of queer, trans, and gender expansive people anywhere in the world unless you went onto the Jerry Springer show where there was a fist fight, right? So having an adequate representation, not only in your culture, but in the agency that you work at, of openly queer, comfortable with themselves, people who can work with LGBTQ plus people is really important because people need to see hope. They need to see the possibility. They need to see that they can have a healthy outcome for their lives. All right, so this is the expansion of the slide earlier. So first we talk about equality and we hand everybody 4 M&Ms and everybody eats their 4 M&Ms and still some people are hungry and some people are not. I don't know why I said M&Ms, but maybe I just really need some chocolate. Equity means that we recognize that some people want M&Ms more than other people do, or need M&Ms more than other people do. And we balance those scales out by making sure that resources are getting to all of the places that people need those resources. And liberation is about getting rid of that fence altogether. So liberation and justice is what we're moving towards for all of our communities, not just LGBTQ plus people, but all of the intersections of community. I'm gonna give you a couple of really unofficial statistics because anybody who was in the room yesterday knows that I'm not up on my HMIS data and I need to enter it. I'm gonna give you some really unofficial numbers that we've come up with just in this past year. And then I'm gonna ask you to talk in your tables for just a little while. So, I should preface this by saying we are not doing outreach for youth right now. We are not saying come and be part of our program. Any young person who has accessed our program has found out about us word of mouth. The reason that we're not doing outreach to our youth population right now is because we're still training host homes. We started doing everything at the exact same time. So young people are finding us, people are finding us from all over the state. We've gotten questions from Fairbanks, from Nome, from Barrow, from Bethel, from Homer, from Seward, from Soldotna. We currently are serving the Mat-Su Valley and Anchorage, and we rolled out services in Mat-Su Valley and Anchorage at the same time very intentionally because almost everybody that's part of Choosing Our Roots comes from another part of the state or maybe even from outside of the state, and we recognize that Anchorage isn't the only thing that is important in Alaska, that people want to stay in their home communities, and that we need to come up with solutions that allow for people to stay wherever they want to be, right? Okay, so my numbers, and then I'll let you talk to each other for a little while. In 1 year, I've screened 43 people for our programming. 36 of those people have been accepted into Choosing Our Roots. The ones that were not accepted into Choosing Our Roots were either over age, and I think that it's important to note, every single one of those people that were over age was a trans feminine identified person of color who was mostly sleeping outside because they have no adequate access to resources. Or if they were within our age range, maybe they were inappropriately referred to our program. And by that, what I mean is there's another program that's better for them. And I didn't just say, sorry, you're not gay, goodbye. I said, how can we help connect you to resources, right? So we do all of those wraparound case management services. All of us know when we work in either small or larger organizations that it's important to know who your collaborators are. So 36 people were accepted into programming. Those folks are sort of in different stages of interaction because we're a low barrier to no barrier service. We will work with you if you are actively engaged in substance misuse. And sometimes that means that if you are actively engaged in substance misuse or having a mental health barrier, you may not show up to meetings. And so you're sort of over here on the we're watching out for you to make sure that you're doing okay, and we're waiting for the moment that you can engage with programming further. And then we've got 20 people currently actively engaged in case management services. 57% of the people that we work with identify as people of color. That's just the people that we're working with right now. I think that if we start doing outreach, we're gonna have a larger percentage there. Of the 57% of the people that we work with who identify as people of color, 72% of those folks are Alaska Native. Of the people of color and Alaska Native people that we work with, 52% are gender expansive transgender people. The reason that I'm mentioning those numbers is that we have this intersection of vulnerability. People who identify as low income, we don't have great statistics on that. Every single participant has identified as low income because they're currently homeless, right? But what their families of origin experienced, we don't always know, right? So people who are low income, people of color and indigenous people, and people who are transgender, that intersection of identity, and people who are under 24, right? So maybe don't have adequate access to a lot of resources. Okay, so now I want you to turn to one another. I'm trying to keep an eye on the clock because when I'm talking, I lose track. Will you help me? You're gonna leave, okay. All right, bad person at that. Somebody help me, somebody say enough. Turn to your tables, and I want you to talk just a little bit with one another about the services that you work in right now and where you think you can do better in serving LGBTQ plus people, okay? So just take maybe 2 minutes and think about where you can do better, and then after that 2 minutes, take another 2 minutes and uplift the things that you're doing really well. Educational opportunities that you have had, a really great success story in your community, okay? And we're gonna do a little bit of share back after that. So 2 minutes about what you can do better, and then 2 minutes about what you're doing well. Thanks. Okay, it's been 2 minutes, so now that you're done talking about what's going wrong, let's talk about what's going right. Another 2 minutes of what's going right. Okay, folks, we're going to draw you back together here. And I'm just going to ask for probably, let's see, 2 different people from different parts of the room to talk about something that you talked about at your table that's a challenge, okay? So if anybody's willing to share a challenge you talked about, raise your hand up. Go ahead.
So my name is David Richburg, and I operate the Brother Francis. Hello, my name is David Richburg. I operate Brother Francis Shelter in Anchorage. It was built in 2005 or so, and we are challenged in serving this population just sort of by the layout of our building. One thing that I think that we do well is we allow people to choose which side of the building they sort of want to be on, and if someone identifies with one way or the other, staff will support that. However, like our shower facility on the men's side is, it's one large shower room. Our shower facility on the women's side is a little bit smaller, and they do have individual stalls. But we don't have, what I would love to be able to do is just have individual showers for everybody. So we're challenged just by sort of the physical layout of our building. And then also being a low barrier facility, being, the largest shelter in the largest city, and really sort of the only year-round low barrier shelter. We try to support individuals that are, have a non-traditional gender identity, through our staff, but those individuals do sometimes get some flack from the other guests. And we try to make our barriers for service very, very low. So if someone is just sort of being mean to somebody or, saying things to somebody or giving people dirty looks, we're not going to put someone out in the cold for that, because, well, that is something that we want to discourage and something that we have conversations with people about. The consequences that we're able to provide for people that are misbehaving, that can be pretty dire, especially this time of year. So we're only going to ask someone to leave the building if they're a health and safety risk. Sometimes people can just be a jerk, and we do our best as staff to discourage that and try to educate people, but we're a little bit limited in how we can modify someone's behavior to be a little bit more accepting.
Okay. Thank you, David. So the challenges that I'm hearing there are both sort of systemic and structural, like we have a space that doesn't adequately serve the people that we're trying to serve, all people that we're trying to serve, but also social, like how do we understand what safety is for the greatest amount of people and how do we really care for all of those folks. And I'm just going to throw in there that the safety concern about housing a trans feminine person with women is actually for the trans feminine person. All of the research demonstrates that that's the case, that the people that experience violence in situations like that are the trans-identified gender-expansive people. And if you are hearing that information and inside you're going, oh, heck no, I don't believe that, come talk to me, and we'll talk about it some, okay? I don't expect that in an hour long we are going to shift from our deeply held belief systems and all be aligned together. I'm just wondering, can we continue to push out what we think of as safe space for as many people as possible? So, Foot, I see your hands up.
I want to gently use the term traditional, and it's just important that we try to refrain from that, because although in some places it seems like, maybe in America it seems like we have these traditional things, if we look back through actual extensive time, there actually have been people who identify with not male or female, or have had these different gender identities. They just were called different things since for always. So it's important for us to not say traditional, because although you're not trying to be offensive in any way, we're trying to find the best language. Just simply saying they don't identify as or just that they're trans. Just trying to guide our language. It's all over the place.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, Foot, because it is about using language like gender expansive, or not using the gender binary, especially when we're talking about American Samoan people have actually 4 genders that they recognize. When we decolonize our gender systems, a lot of indigenous communities have multiple genders and multiple ways that people identify within their community. Dejanay, I think I see you with the microphone.
Yeah, I'm with My House, Dejanay Hill. I think I'm going to circle back around. I think Foot kind of went off that way. But the problem I think that we struggle with is, one, we don't collect correct data for the LGBTQ population. I mean, Foot mentioned earlier that HMIS doesn't even capture any of that type of data. So that's one thing. Also, we're not educated on the different types of trans, pan, and all that. But I can tell you that there are improvements made. Kara mentioned this earlier, that one, at My House, we've made the bathrooms unisex, so a person who identifies as one thing but looks like another thing shouldn't feel uncomfortable using the bathroom. Another thing that we do, actually, My House partners with Choosing Our Roots. We have several LGBTQ population people in the building every day working. And I just think we just need that educational piece, and be aware that if someone prefers to be called he or she or they, that we honor that and respect that. It could take some time. I still mess up all the time, but still we want to always make that person feel comfortable and in their own skin and whatever they believe in.
I thank you for saying that. I want to acknowledge that as a 43-year-old person who's been partnered to trans and queer people since I was 18, I still make mistakes. So it's okay for us to say we can do better. It's okay for us to catch ourselves and say, oh, sorry, I used the wrong pronoun, let me try again. Or, oh, sorry, I just assumed something about you instead of asking you, let me try again. Let's go to things that we're doing well for just a couple of minutes. 2 different people. Something that you're doing well in serving LGBTQ people.
Denise Gilroy. I am the executive director for Arctic Access, which is an independent living center in the Northwest, North Arctic region. And I am very, very proud to tell you that we have a safe house.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Yeah,
So,
that's amazing.
And that was a huge accomplishment. And that was not something that happened overnight. Mm-hmm. And my mission is people that experience disabilities and seniors. Finding a safe house is not an easy thing to do, but once you do it, it is a fabulous accomplishment. And the lives you save cannot replace, and I encourage all of you to find a safe house.
That's awesome. I had no idea you had a safe house. That's really great. It's exciting. People need to have places that they can go where they feel affirmed and held. Yeah. Did anybody else have a thing you're doing great? See flat faces. All right. I believe that there are things that you are doing great. And I think that those things that you are doing great might be sitting here in this room having this conversation with me while I knock over my water. It might be having conversations with one another. It might be, do we see a hand raised? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see. Yeah. Sitka Youth Advocates.
Kara with Sitka Youth Advocates. Some of the changes that we've made in our facility is the verbiage on all the applications to make it, for everyone and the comfort level. It's we've really made huge changes in who reach out to us, and also in our teen youth center we do a lot of events, like Pizza Pride, and it's been great, and the amount of comfort that it has given the LGBTQ folks, it's been tremendous, and we continue to make a larger, just I guess like trying to reach out and being a safe place and environment for all of them.
Perfect, thank you. I'm gonna try to skip through some slides here. We all want to belong, right? Yep.
While you flip through slides,
Yep.
Brian and I have to go to the legislative lunch and learn, and I just want to emphasize that this is such a critical conversation. It's unfortunate timing that we are beckoned over to the Capitol building, but I appreciate you guys and cannot wait to hear the rest of the discussion on the video.
Great, and we're gonna come see you during the lunch and learn as soon as we're done here. But we're gonna stay until we're done here. All right, so the reason I was flipping through that, so I intended on sort of staying on that we all need a place to belong, we all want to belong slide a little bit longer so we could talk about what belonging means in our smaller groups. But I'm looking at time and I'm looking at the conversation that we're just having, and what LGBTQ plus young people and also people in general want is community support. Right? So you're talking about community support by being visibly affirming and accepting and actually creating safer spaces. Not just saying you're creating safer spaces, but creating truly safer spaces. Healthy and out role models who look like them. I will tell you something, we're part of a multi-generational community with Choosing Our Roots, and our participants that come into programming often say, today, the day that I came to my first Choosing Our Roots potluck, was the first time that I was in a multi-generational community of queer and trans people where everybody was healthy and happy and having positive outcomes in their life. People need to be able to see people like them working in the systems that they're accessing. Right? Now that doesn't mean every LGBTQ plus person is going to be perfect about serving this population. And it doesn't mean that if you have a staff of 3, you have to fire somebody so that you can hire a queer person, but do that because we're underemployed. We all want a sense of belonging within our organizations, and there is space for everyone, regardless of our deeply held belief systems being different from one another's. There is space for everyone. And what we are doing when we create safer spaces for LGBTQ plus people, especially young people, is we are saving lives. We are literally saving lives. So here's another place where I would like for us to have maybe 2 minutes of conversation about what the difference is between tolerating LGBTQ plus people and affirming LGBTQ plus people. So if you can just take 2 minutes to talk to somebody near you about the difference between tolerating and affirming, I would really appreciate that. Thank you. Okay, folks, I'm going to have you come back to the larger group. I know these are just little snippets of talking to one another, but it's really important that we continue to share our thoughts and experiences with one another. I think probably everybody in the room has heard of trauma-informed care, and I suspect that some people in the room have heard of healing-centered engagement. And healing-centered engagement is sort of the trauma-informed care 2.0, right? And part of healing-centered engagement is having these conversations with one another and understanding what it means to be healing your own experiences within a larger context of the community that you're part of. So when we talk about what's the difference between tolerating and affirming, and I'm not going to go around the room for your words, though I want to hear them. I think that we're on a little bit of a tight timeline, and I want to make sure we can get to that lunch and learn too. When we talk about the difference between tolerating and affirming, we're talking about the difference between putting up with somebody being in your presence and saying to somebody, your life has value. So there are probably a lot of different ideas that we bounced around out there. Mine's right. No, I'm joking. All of them are probably right in some fashion. And when it comes down to it, I think that what we really need to look at is that creating affirming and safe spaces for LGBTQ plus people means that we are treating people as though they have inherent dignity for being a human being. The end, okay? So I always like to have some practical things. That's not true. I don't always like to have practical things. I'm a really let's just get into the weeds and talk about our theories and then hug each other consensually afterwards. But I think that it's good to walk away with some practical ideas about how you can make a difference either within the system that you're operating within or the system that you're collaborating within. And I think, as somebody who's lived in various regions of the state, that it is about all of us collaborating together, especially for this particular subpopulation. I don't like the phrase subpopulation, for this population of people. I think that it's important that we collaborate with one another because no attention has been paid to LGBTQ plus people for a very long time. Now, I will say, I'm gonna call out Covenant House here for just a second. 25 years ago, I stayed at Covenant House Alaska in Anchorage for 2 weeks. I found that it wasn't an affirming space for me at that juncture. Covenant House has done amazing work to educate staff, to hire people. Right here, we talk about funding the incorporation of LGBTQ plus peer providers in shelters. The space there at Covenant House Alaska right now is so much more welcoming and affirming for people than it has been historically. And we all know that we're in the work together all of the time to make it ever more inviting and welcoming for folks. We also want to make sure that we have some dedicated services for LGBTQ plus people, youth specifically. And part of that is that, I've been in a lot of conversations with folks where they say, I am just not equipped or comfortable to serve this population. And on the one hand, we talk about reducing silos all of the time, right? Figuring out a way to serve all of our populations equitably and wholly. And on the other hand, if there's just no way that you are going to be able to empower, provide hope, create dignity, and create safe space for an LGBTQ plus person, by all means, send them to me. Because it's more important that those very vulnerable people feel heard and seen and feel like they are part of a community that cares for them than it is for you to change your system, okay? I want you to change your system. Let's move towards justice. Let's move towards liberation for all of our people. I want you to change your system, but if you can't, it's okay, because some of us will figure it out together. We want to make sure that there is emergency housing available no matter where you are in the state, where an LGBTQ plus person can get inside and not fear for their safety, not have to hide all of who they are, just in order to access a service. We want to make sure that there are LGBTQ plus stakeholders in all of our planning conversations. I know that there are queer and trans and gender expansive people that are part of this discussion. I know, based on all of you standing up earlier, that every single person who is in the room at the beginning of this discussion has an LGBTQ plus person in their life that they love, okay? I also know that in almost all spaces, the only people that are talking about queer issues are choosing our roots. So we've got to lift that up and get more stakeholders in the room. And not only that, but if you're an ally, let's work together to figure out how you can take some of that burden from me. I will carry one side of the basket, you carry the other, okay? Choosing Our Roots is super awesome because 50% of our board of directors is made up of people under the age of 25 who are LGBTQ, most of whom have experienced homelessness. That means that half of my bosses are young people who are either accessing our services, wish that our services had been around for them to access, are people that know people who need our services, and it guides everything about our programming. Anytime we think that we're doing something well, we bring it back to the young people and we say, what do you think? And almost every single time we shift and we change and we find a new way of doing things. And that's awesome. And I encourage you, no matter what system you work in, to make sure that stakeholders are not just saying, this is a good idea, but are actually actively engaged in the making of policy, the making of procedure. Is that okay? So, training's ongoing. Modeling behavior is essential, right? So I walk into spaces and I hear young people say, that's so gay. And I see service providers go, okay. And we need service providers to say, oh, does that mean it's super awesome? Does it mean it's rad? Does it mean that it's full of rainbows and glitter? What does that mean when you say that's so gay? And address bias and hate language immediately, because we're not gonna just change everybody's mind right away, but we do need to create safer spaces for our LGBTQ plus youth. They hear that, and they notice when you don't respond, and so do the adults. We wanna ask the questions, we wanna gather the data. In HMIS, in Choosing Our Roots entry forms, there are some drop-downs. They're still not adequate to reflect the populations that we work with. Dejanay was talking earlier about not knowing the difference between all of the different sorts of identity words that folks use. And I will admit that I had never heard the word pansexual until I started working with people in Choosing Our Roots. And I was like, what does that mean? I need to educate myself further, right? And there's no drop down that says pansexual. There's no drop down that says queer. And that drop down is not there for adult populations. So I have people calling me saying, nobody has ever asked me if I'm trans before. I access services in whatever community I'm in, and nobody's even asked me that question. So we need to ask the questions, we need to gather the data, and if you're uncomfortable asking the questions, find somebody at your agency who's comfortable asking the questions. And if you have nobody at your agency that's comfortable asking the questions, let's do a training. Let's all get together and brainstorm together and figure out the best way of asking those questions in a way that keeps you feeling safe and comfortable and keeps the person that you're asking the questions of feeling safe and comfortable. When somebody tells you who they are, just believe them. You don't have to accept that that's going to be who they are for the rest of their eternity. I always like telling so much of my story. So when I first came out, I said, I'm a lesbian, and that lasted for approximately 2 weeks because I decided that word did not fit for me, right? And so over the course of my life, from coming out at the age of 16 to where I am now at 43, I come out all of the time and I find new words to describe who I am, and that doesn't mean that I wasn't those things that I said that I was before. At one point, I was a single person. Now I'm a married person, married to a minister. So at one point, I was not a minister's wife. At one point, I was not a parent, right? We find words to describe our experience right now, today. And when somebody tells you who they are, you have to believe that that's who they are right there in that moment, and you have to show up for their whole self. Pronouns are a conversation that it's funny, like people get really stuck on this pronoun thing. Why should we say what our pronouns are at the beginnings of meetings? Only trans people use pronouns. That's not true. Everybody uses pronouns, by the way. And the reason why we use the pronoun that somebody says they want for us to use and the name that that person goes by is because we're creating safer space merely by doing that. That's one of your most low barrier ways of not having to shift anything else about your system, but to create safer space for people because it invites people to be their whole selves. Somebody was talking about unisex bathrooms. Was it Dejanay? My son, and Kara, you were talking about unisex bathrooms too. My son is always saying, I don't understand what the big deal is about. Everybody uses the same bathroom in our house. This is true, right? Okay, so actually let me pop back here for just a second. Oh, okay, I know what I want to do. We're really running out of time. I want to leave a little bit of space if there are any questions that people have so that I can try my best to answer those questions. And I also want to invite you into one idea of an exercise that you can do tonight, if you want, or maybe next week if you remember. And that is to sit down and take 5 minutes and just think about who you are right now, okay? Good, bad, and ugly. Who am I right now? I am a person that actually got some sleep last night. Woo! I am also a person that is sometimes having a hard time regulating my emotions in spaces because I have to be openly queer, and that makes me feel unsafe sometimes when I'm the only person that's talking about it, right? I'm a person who is really trying to be kinder. I really want to be kinder, and I want to be more patient. I'm also a person who really likes myself, right? So I want you to sit down and I want you to think about who you are today and maybe take 5 minutes writing that all down. And then I want you to think about who you are becoming. Who are you going to be tomorrow, the next day? Where do you want to go, right? We're all growing all of the time. And we can find ways of keeping that space for one another to grow and learn together. And part of that starts with just knowing where you want to go. So, questions. Does anybody have any? I can't believe that I talked for 53 minutes. Does anyone have any questions right now or thoughts that you might like to share? Terry, let's wait until we get the microphone over to you so that everybody can hear you. And while the microphone's going over to Terry, I just want to say that if you don't feel comfortable asking questions or making comments, I'm going to just go like this. Host homes are awesome. You should check us out. There's my email address, and there's my phone number, and you can call me, and I'll do my best.
I just want to ask what the principles were for your organization, because you have a unique organization.
Yeah. Thank you. Do I have the principles on here? Okay, there we go. Okay, so core principles. So I'm a social worker, so I really like to get into it and start working right away. And I was super frustrated because 3 years ago, we just had to sit down and talk a lot about what we wanted to do and what our value system was and what our principles were. And these are the 5 principles that we landed on: dignity and respect, empowerment, cultural relevancy, community, and hope. And it's hard for me to sort of say this is what these principles mean because they mean different things for each person that participates in CORE. We're a collective organization, and what we do is we try to sit down and really listen to one another. I said get in the weeds earlier. We really do get into the weeds sometimes. And we try to make sure that all voices are being amplified in those conversations. So what dignity and respect means to Terry, for example, might mean something different than what it means to me. What we're doing is we're striving towards an environment where all people feel heard, where we sit down and we have difficult conversations and we work through those difficult conversations together, where we are really focused on finding, earlier we talked about what's going right. We want to hold on to those things that are going right and keep on lifting those things up, right? Finding new ways of things going right, because empowerment is something that we are doing together, not providing to the people that we serve. Does that make sense to everyone? Cultural relevancy is the idea that understanding somebody's culture is a movable thing. So people have their cultural experiences that they grew up in, the cultural experiences that they hold on to right now, and culture is changing all of the time. So remaining culturally relevant means remaining engaged in growth. It says, I don't know, so I'm going to ask questions, and when I get those answers, I'm going to believe them and continue to expand what I'm doing based on the answers that I've gotten. Community. So I love the principle of community because our principle of community is that we're not simply housing LGBTQ plus young people. We are transforming and healing community together, that we're all part of a lot of different communities. And I've heard at First Alaskans Institute that we either take off all of our hats and just show up as that person, or we put on all of our hats at the same time and show up as that person, right? So part of community is saying, what communities do I have a stake in? How do I draw those communities together? When somebody is not part of a community that I'm a part of, how do I share in that community with them? And then this last principle of hope was the principle that I argued for like 3 hours, I swear. Because people are like, hope, how do we measure hope? And I sort of said, well, why do we need to measure hope? We just need to have some, right? We need to have something that we're looking forward to. We need to have a light down there that says there's going to be a future where people walk into a room and they feel comfortable being all of their authentic self. Terry, I don't know if I described principles in the way that you were hoping that I would describe them. Good, okay. One thing that I do want to say is that we have a holocratic structure in our organization. Well, we have as close to a holocratic structure as you can get. And a holocracy is an organization that is sort of flat without hierarchy, and then leaders rise up as needed and then settle back into the collective, right? And we really like this structure because it means that we are able to continually centralize all of our conversations on the most vulnerable voices that are in the room at that moment. It also means that collaborating with us sometimes has people going, whoa, what's happening? People like to call me the executive director. I have an out-facing title of director of programming. I like to introduce myself as the paid staff person for a volunteer collective organization because that's what I actually am, right? And I keep on saying that we should just all describe ourselves as directors, right? So today I'm going to be the director of Walking in Sleet. All right, any other questions, thoughts, anything that people would like to share right now? I'm going to go back to the last slide that has my email address and phone number. Whoops, there we go. Folks, for probably 25 years, I've been waking up in the morning and reminding myself that I'm not broken because I'm a queer person. The world is broken if it doesn't accept me as my whole self. And if I still have to do that every single day, I want you to think about what the young people that we're serving or the chronically homeless LGBTQ plus people that we're serving, how they're feeling, how hard it is to find a sense that they belong in this world. And I believe that we all belong in this world. So thank you for staying here and doing this work with one another. Choosing Our Roots hopes to be statewide in the next 10 years. Our program, the host home model, can be implemented in communities that are 300 people and in communities that are 300,000 people. It works all over the country. It works all over the world. And so Sitka Youth Advocates has a host home program. There are a couple of other organizations in the state that have tried host home programming. Let's keep on talking about what this looks like. And I know YHDP, the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program, is going to talk a little bit about all of the different ideas that we're talking about on a statewide level. So call me if you have questions. Thank you for being here. I appreciate you.